Catching trout on dry flies is likely what we all pictured when we got into fly fishing in the first place. Tying on these tiny little flies and throwing long, graceful casts that shimmer in the sunlight and setting the hook into a big old brown trout is about as romantic as it gets. But if you fished with dry flies at all, then you know there is a ton more that goes into being successful at it, right? You've got to manage the drift of your fly against the currents. You've got to cast against the wind. You've got to listen to everything the river is telling you and adjust your approach accordingly. It demands a different kind of attention than fishing with nymphs or streamers does, and that leaves a ton of room for you to improve your skills. On today's show, I'm going to walk you through 5 tips that I've learned that will help you take your dry fly fishing from just okay to freaking fantastic.
This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. You know, I'm really excited for what we've got on tap this week. We're going to be talking about something that I love, and if you've listened to this show at all, or you've watched any of our masterclass videos on YouTube, you know that I've got a little bit of a love affair with fishing dry flies. So the fact that I get to spend a whole episode today talking about it is a ton of fun. Now, like I promised in the hook to the show, you're going to learn some stuff that's going to help you level up your dry fly fishing skills. And to help you learn those tips, I am going to lead off with a story, because I think this story really illustrates everything that I want to talk about. Me and Alex, we recently spent 2 days fishing the Green River below Flaming Gorge in Utah. And for those of you who've never been there, the Green River below the gorge, the first 7 miles of that, the river goes through this beautiful red rock canyon. The walls are, I don't know how high they are, 500, 600, 1,000 feet. They're tall, but they're huge, they're sheer, and there's very little bank, and you're just in this beautiful big river at the bottom of this really steep canyon. And that's where Flaming Gorge got its name from, right? John Wesley Powell, when he explored it for the first time, he went down and he wrote in his journal that the walls of the canyon looked like they were aflame, and so that's where we got the Flaming Gorge name from. And the green through that section, it's home to like 12,000 trout per mile, so you would think your odds are really good, but you can still get skunked there. Not that I would ever speak from personal experience on that at all, but there's tons of fish there. The fish are really big. The average size in that section is about 17 inches. That's really good. And the water's just crystal clear, right? It's like fishing in an aquarium sometimes. You can see all the fish in there. It's really frustrating because you can see the fish as they don't eat your flies, but it really is just a wonderful, wonderful fishery. Everybody should go visit it if they've never been there. It's somewhere that I think everybody needs to fish at least once in their life. And when Alex and I were just recently there, the blue-winged olives were hatching. The weather was really cloudy and cool. The river wasn't too crowded, so the conditions were absolutely perfect for some incredible dry fly fishing. Now, the only issue there is that blue wings are mercurial little critters. They keep to their own schedule. They hatch when they feel like it, instead of when us anglers perceive that it's the best time for them to do so. And trout gain an almost single-minded focus on a particular stage of the blue wing hatch, and puzzling out whether they're eating an emerger or a cripple or a dun. And those are all different stages of that the bug goes through in its life cycle. And I'll get into those in detail later on. But if you don't know what an emerger, a cripple, or a dun is, it's just different life cycle stages of the mayfly. And figuring out if the fish are eating those, it's one of the challenges that makes me love fishing the blue wing hatch in particular more than any other. I love the blue wing hatches. I look forward to them. I can't get enough of them. And on our first day with our guide, we were in a boat and we pulled the boat into an eddy right as the fish started rising in earnest. And an eddy, for those who may not know, is a section of the river where the current goes around in a giant circle, almost kind of like a whirlpool, but not that fast. The eddy that we parked in was boiling with trout, who didn't seem to care that we stood on the bank with our rods in hand, planning out our cast, figuring out how we were going to put the sneak on these fish. Now, in retrospect, the fish didn't have much to fear, at least for me, because I screwed it up a little bit. I had limited room for a back cast, which meant that I'd need to double haul my line out into the eddy without letting it splash. The wind was also blowing in my face, which was adding another layer of difficulty to the cast. Now, against all those odds, and I never professed to be a champion caster by any stretch. I can get my flies where I want them, and I can do it a majority of the time, so I'm okay at casting. But against all those odds, I made a decent cast that landed in the vicinity of some rising trout. But my flies were quickly pulled out of that lane by the current in the eddy. My flies started shooting across the surface of the water like they were on jet skis, pushing up this huge wake, and the fish took notice of all that drag, and they slowly moved right on out of casting range. They left me on the bank, rod in my hand, and no fish in the net. Later, on that first day, I ended up putting a few fish in the net, but it was a slog. I had to cycle through a half dozen flies before finally settling on a crippled blue-winged olive pattern that seemed to do the ticket when I could get it to drift without drag and the wind didn't throw the flies back into my face. Well, those are the caveats. In order to be successful, I had to pull that off. On our second day on the river, we ended up in a famous pool on the green. If you've ever floated the A section of the green, you've heard of it, Lake Bonneville. It's an enormous pool, 300-400 yards long, maybe even longer than that, with a distinct eddy. And we parked our boat at the top of the pool, casting down this seam line to rising trout that dimpled the river surface. My go-to cripple from the day before was getting ignored, so my guide suggested that I tie on a midge emerger. The midges were out in force too, and there was a good chance the trout were keyed in on those bugs instead of the blue-winged olives. It was early enough in the day that the blue wings weren't out in full force like they had been. They just hadn't fully started their hatch yet. So it was a very good guess that midges were what was on the menu. So I tied on that midge emerger from my guide. I made a long cast, and the guide kept the boat positioned perfectly while fish rose all around my fly. We waited for almost 5 minutes with that drift before a fish finally came up and ate the midge emerger, confirming the suspicion of our guide, and I did not flub the cast. The day before, I missed, I don't know how many fish I missed. I missed so many takes the day before. Now, that euphoria of catching that fish was very short-lived because not a minute after I released that first fish, it started raining. Now, that was really good for us because it turned the blue-winged olive hatch on like popcorn in a machine. It felt like it was at the movie theaters, man. The fish switched from midges to mayflies, but there were literally thousands of those mayflies on the water. And for those of you watching the video podcast, Alex has added some of the footage we shot that day so you can see just how many blue wings there were on the water. And I sat there looking at all those bugs on the water, and I kept thinking to myself, how would my fly stand out in this literal sea of mayflies that we have going on here? That's when Alex suggested that I use a fly that I'm not all that fond of, the purple haze. I don't even know why I'm not very fond of it. I just have never liked it. I've always thought it was a bit of a gimmick, but Alex has had a lot of luck with it. And he handed one to me and said, try this, because I was getting my butt kicked and we needed some footage. Well, I tied it on in a size 14, and that quickly proved to us it was the ticket. That was the fly the fish wanted. And it consistently produced fish when other patterns wouldn't, finally forcing me to admit that the purple haze ain't all that bad. So what lessons do we learn from that time on the water? Put that little story together for you. What does it teach us? What does it teach us about fishing with dry flies? Well, the way I see it, there's 5 lessons I learned there. And these are lessons that I know, and I think this is an important thing for every angler to hear. You are going to learn the same lessons again and again and again and again and again on the water. The key to being a really good angler is actually learning from those lessons. I should have said that you were going to experience the same lessons. Whether or not you learn from them is up to you. You're going to experience the same lessons. Good anglers are the ones who learn from them. And some of them require a lot of learning. And if you're like me, I don't know that, like, I know some guys, I've fished with some guys who are just naturally gifted at fly fishing. They just inherently understand it. It makes sense to them. They're fishy people. I'm not one of those. I've had to work very hard to be able to catch the fish that I do. And when you're in that situation like me, and I reckon a lot of us are in that situation, it is important to not be upset that you have to learn these lessons over and over and over. And this is just the most recent example, this trip with Alex. It's just the most recent example of lessons that I have to learn over and over and over because it's continually reinforcing to me the things that I've got to focus on, right? And those 5 things that I picked out from this, I'll jump into them right now for you. And the first one of those is that your presentation matters a lot. Now, I harp on this a lot. I talk all the time about how important it is to get a good presentation, right? It's like Alex watches a lot of cooking shows. He even makes me watch them when we're, at the hotel or the Airbnb at night after filming. He'll turn it on, and he doesn't appreciate my commentary all the time. But they're always talking about, the presentation on this creme brulee was just not quite up to par or something like that. And I don't want to sound like the food guy, but presentation really does matter. It makes an enormous difference. All right, think back to that first eddy that I told you guys about in this story. I had that really tricky cast to make, and I just couldn't seal the deal because with all that limited backcast room that I had, the wind and the current, it was extremely tough to get the flies where they needed to be. There were also a few other times that I didn't talk about, but my casts were so bad where I landed the flies either too far ahead of the fish or too far back, or I landed the fly line in the wrong place where it actually put the rising fish down. They were up eating off the top. I made a bad cast, and the fish said, that ain't natural, and they went back down and ignored us. Mayfly hatches can be extremely tough to fish, especially early in the season with low, clear water, and I got my butt kicked more than a few times on that most recent trip to the green. So the best advice I have for you guys as far as presentation concerns dry fly fishing is focus on getting soft, natural presentations. You don't want those dry flies. Usually, you don't want them to slap the water. Some flies you do. Hoppers, it can be beneficial to slap the water. Cicadas, it can be beneficial to slap the water with. Salmon flies, it can even be. But most of your dry flies, especially mayflies, they need a soft, natural presentation. Make sure you're not landing your fly line on the fish, especially ones that are actively rising. That's what we call lining the fish. If you land your fly line on top of them, they're going to skedaddle. If you land the really thick part of your leader on them, they might skedaddle. You might not be able to land any leader near them and have to kind of angle your cast so that only the fly drifts over them and not any of your leader. You got to experiment with that. You'll get a feel for when fish require that level of stealth. Right. The second thing, this goes along with presentation, but it is important enough to reiterate on its own, and that is drag makes a huge difference. Okay, remember in that first eddy I mentioned how bad the current pulled the line and it made my flies look like they were riding jet skis? Yeah, it was a problem throughout the entire trip. I had issues with getting my flies to drift without any drag. And it was kind of frustrating, but the times if I could get it without drag and I could get it in front of the fish, it was almost automatic. But I had I just had a difficult time with it for whatever reason. The conditions were kind of kicking my butt. One thing that was very interesting, though, is we didn't fish anything smaller than a 4X tippet. Right? This is a crowded tailwater, lots of fish, lots of bugs, lots of picky fish. We didn't fish anything smaller than 4X tippet. The tippet size didn't matter. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it'll create some micro drag, but in this instance, it didn't, or the fish just didn't care about it, which was really interesting because, you think sometimes in these instances, well, I need to downsize my tippet. I need to go down to smaller tippet, and that'll get the fly or the fish to eat the fly. That's not what happened. It was all related to drag, right? Too much drag, the fish ignored it. So you've got to be very careful with your dry flies to eliminate as much drag as you possibly can, especially with your mayflies. Third lesson that I think we learned from that little story is all about patience, right? Remember when I mentioned during the story, it was the second day and I had that midge emerger on the water and I let it sit there for like 5 minutes. Well, it was extremely tough to just not pick it up and cast every fish that was rising and to just let it sit there because I didn't want to spook any fish with bad casts. I didn't want to land the fly too hard and put any rising fish down. I just let it sit there, and eventually the fish came around to my fly, ate it, and I think the fish I caught on that fly was one of the biggest of the whole trip. So it was 100% worth the patience that I put into it, but it was extremely difficult to force myself to behave that way. And that just goes to show the value of patience in fly fishing, especially when it comes to throwing dries on calm, slow, clear water like that big pool on the green. It's also good to remember as well that you are not going to catch every fish you cast to. And you might need to be patient as you work from fish to fish, finding the ones that are willing to cooperate. That's something that it does take an adjustment in the mindset, I think, to accept and then move on from the fact that you're not going to catch every fish you cast to. Sometimes it's just not going to work out, and you have to be okay with that. You've got to be able to move on from that, especially with dry fly fishing. You've got to know when the fish has said no, and we've got to move on. And there's a story, I believe. I don't want to get it mixed up here, but I think it was Tom Rosenbauer who told this story about fishing here in Wyoming with a guy over in Jackson Hole, and they cast to a cutthroat trout for 3 hours. The two of them refused them for 3 hours. They could not get it to eat. They finally gave up and moved on to other fish. Now, that's kind of an extreme example, 3 hours on one fish, but it also just goes to show Tom Rosenbauer's a great angler. That fish still kicked his butt. It's going to happen to everybody. It's going to happen to all of us, right? So that is just a point that I think is worth driving home, especially for new anglers who might feel frustrated that they cast 20 risers and only caught 5 of them, right? That just might be a good ratio for you, depending on the water that you're fishing. All right, our fourth tip. This one goes into decoding the hatch. And what I mean by decoding the hatch is that often when flies hatch, it's not just one species coming off all at once. The reason I caught that first nice fish on the midge emerger is that there were midges hatching along with the blue-winged olives, and the blue-winged olives were doing what's called masking the midge hatch, where the blue wings are on the water. They're in such great numbers that you automatically assume, oh, well, the fish are eating the blue wings. Okay. You don't even look to see if the fish are actually eating something else. And that day that Alex and I were on the green, it was really tough to see that the fish actually were eating those midges and not the blue wings, right? This goes back to another principle that I talk about all the time, which is the value of watching and waiting before you make your cast. Take some time to observe the water. Let the river teach you and tell you what's going on. You are going to learn a ton from that. You're going to be able to set yourself up for a lot of success. If you think the fish are eating a certain bug just because it's what you see in the air or on the water, I think you should try and confirm that by watching a fish eat one off of the top. Otherwise, you run the risk of fishing the fly that the trout aren't looking for, and that is part of why I had such a tough day, right? This is also decoding the hatch. We can also get into what I mentioned earlier about cripples versus emergers versus duns, right? For those who don't know, for those who might be new to this, mayflies go through, and a lot of other dry flies too, but we mainly refer to this with mayflies. When they go from their nymph form, which is the underwater form, to their dun form, which is the adult form with wings, right? They do what's called an emergence. They emerge from their nymph into the dun form. So they're getting up out of their nymphal shuck. They're stuck in the water column, and they're trying to dry their wings off so they can fly away and, get some mayfly business done, right? Well, the flies that get stuck right there in the surface film, we call those emergers, right? And fish love to eat emergers because they are an easier fly to eat. They don't have the same risk of flying away as an adult does. And They're in the surface film, so they're a little bit easier to get to for the trout instead of having to come break the water surface completely. So emergers are going to be something to definitely key in on. But then if they're eating the duns, you'll be able to watch them eat the big adult mayflies and then cripples. This is the other issue too, is sometimes a cripple is exactly what it sounds like. It's a bug that maybe has a broken wing or it didn't emerge right or something's wrong with it. It's an adult version of the bug, but it's kind of stuck laying weird, and the fish will love the cripples because, again, it's a high protein, high calorie value meal, but it's easy to access for those trout. So they just look at the cripple and they're like, ooh, that's not going to get away. They spend their energy on that instead of the adult dun and look at it. Oh, it's got wings. It might get away, right? So that's your difference between your cripples, your emergers, and your duns. And it does pay, it will give you a lot more success to also observe the rise forms so you know if the fish are eating cripples versus emergers or duns, right? Because the way the fish rises will tell you what they're eating. When they eat an emerger, usually you're only going to see their dorsal fin and their tail fin break the surface. You won't see their nose come up out of the water hardly at all. When they're eating off the top of the water, when they're eating those adults, you'll see their nose break the surface. And then cripples, pardon me, it can look like a little bit of both. But what I like to do is I'll fish. If I'm seeing them eat duns off the top, if they're eating the adult, I'll put an adult, so I'll put a dun like a parachute, blue wing on, and then I'll tie a crippled blue wing on about 18 inches behind that, fish 2 dry flies. And most of the time they'll go for the cripple more than they will for the parachute because, again, it's just an easier meal for them to get around. And when Alex and I were on the river, right, we had to spend a lot of time decoding the hatch this way as well because we would watch the hatch as it progressed. In the mornings, they'd be eating emergers, and then they'd switch to the duns as the midges and the adults started coming off. And then once the hatch started dying down, they would really key in on the cripples, and then they'd go back to eating the midges because the midges kind of hatched all day. So as you watch the hatch progress, you're going to get into that as well. But spending the time to decode the hatch and just really understand what's going on is going to help you have a ton more success as a dry fly angler. Now, our last tip, and I did not save this for the end because it's the least important, right? It just fit here. But it goes down to a concept that I've thought about a lot lately and that I think has a lot more applications to fly fishing than maybe we realize, and that is contrast is huge. What I mean by that is when you're fishing a big hatch and there's tons of bugs on the water, you have to find a way to make your dry fly stand out. One way to do that is, like I mentioned, you fish a cripple instead of a dun because, again, that cripple is viewed as an easier meal target. Another option is to fish a fly that's bigger than the naturals on the water. I have a few guide friends who swear by this, including the fishiest fellow I know. He swears by fishing this way, and it works. By fishing that bigger fly, it gets a trout's attention and hopefully gets them to eat. If there's a bunch of size 16s on the water, try a size 14 instead. The purple haze, you remember I tied that on and it worked for us. It came in clutch. And it did so well because it offered a contrast both in size and in color. Okay, it was a sharp contrast between all the other naturals on the water. That made it stand out and made the fish more willing to eat it because they saw it. They realized that, hey, that looks, that purple haze still had the same shape. It still looked like a mayfly as the rest of all the dries that were on the water. It was just a bigger, more calorie-rich meal. So the fish were like, yeah, that looks like what else should be there. So they went ahead and ate it, right? Doing this, having that contrast, it's a classic example of what it means to unmatch the hatch, which if you've heard about unmatching the hatch, that's what it means. It means you throw something that's just a little bit different than all the naturals that are on the water to hopefully get the attention of the trout. Oh, that was a lot. Thanks for bearing with me, folks. Hopefully that was educational, though, going through all that stuff about dry fly fishing. And if you have any questions, any more questions, you want some clarification on any of that dry fly stuff, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. I'd love to chat with you more about it. And with that, we are going to dive into the Q&A section of this week's show. Drew from Georgia is going to lead us off this week in the Q&A section with his question that says, I've been trying to learn how to fly fish for several years now and had very little success catching fish. That is, until I made a deep dive into this podcast and YouTube series. Yesterday, I put what I've learned to the test and landed more trout in a single fishing day than I had before, on a popular tailwater no less. Thanks for that. My question pertains to vintage rods. I was handed down an old bamboo 7.5 foot 4-weight, and that's what I've been using to start out. I've been using weight forward line, but one of your masterclass videos made me think a double taper might suit the bamboo better. What are your thoughts on line choice and the benefits, faults to a short, slow rod? Also, would it be worth having a 9 foot 5-weight on hand too? Hey, Drew, great questions. And thank you so much for sharing what you did about your success with all the stuff we've been teaching here at VFC. I mean, that's what we do this for, is to hear stories like that. So thank you so much, man. That makes us all worth it. And congrats on your bamboo rod as well. I'm actually just finishing up building myself a 7 foot 9-inch 5-weight bamboo rod. I love them. I love fishing bamboo. Before I dive into answering your question in full, I just want to give a brief primer to those who may not be familiar with double taper versus weight forward lines and what all that means. Weight forward lines are the most popular. It's the ones that almost everybody uses. That's what comes spooled up on the reels that we send out with our fly flingers here at VFC. And the difference is that weight forward lines, like their name implies, they have all the weight in the head of the fly line, usually in that first 30 feet or so. So by putting all the mass of their fly line up there, what it does is it helps load our faster, stiffer rods more effectively and more quickly, putting all that mass and compacting it into a shorter section helps make the rod bend a little bit more and gives you more feedback at traditional trout fishing distances. And then that weight forward line is a little bit easier to cast at longer distances than a double taper. Now, a double taper line has the mass evenly distributed throughout the entire length of the line, which is usually about 90 feet. So they will cast with a bit more delicacy. They don't have all the weight up front, so it doesn't hit the water as hard. And double taper lines are excellent at roll casting. So those are your main differences between the two. Now, with that said, double tapers are great for bamboo. I personally run double tapers on all of my bamboo rods that I fish. And honestly, a lot of my slower graphite rods in general for a few reasons. But the main one has to do with energy transfer when we look specifically at bamboo fly rods. A bamboo rod flexes in all of its sections from the tip down to the butt. During the cast of the bamboo rod, you utilize every section of the rod. A double taper line distributes the mass of the fly line more evenly than a weight forward does. So the energy transfer from the rod to the line is more even, and that results in a smoother, more delicate casting experience. A weight forward line will quicken your bamboo rod up a little bit. It'll be more effective at longer distances or with larger flies. But if you're fishing bamboo, you're likely more focused on smaller flies at shorter distances anyways. Short, slow rods are great for delicate presentations, and they're more accurate than longer rods, right? Short rods make tighter loops, and tighter loops are accurate loops. So you do get that with your shorter rods. Now, the downside with a shorter rod comes when you need to throw a really long cast. They might not have the oomph, or if you need to punch line through a stiff wind. Shorter rods may not be as good at that. They don't give you nearly as much reach as a longer rod either, which makes high sticking a little bit difficult and can sometimes make mending a little bit harder as well. So those are your benefits and trade-offs with those shorter rods versus longer rods. Now, as to your last question, yes, everybody absolutely needs a 9 foot 5-weight. They are the do-it-all rod of fly fishing. Everyone can benefit from owning one. In my podcast room right now, I am looking at 4 9 foot 5-weights over there in the corner. And that's just what's in this room. I've got more fly rods in the other room, which that's a whole other thing. But hashtag more fly rods than friends, right? The reason that I champion the 9 foot 5-weight so much is it can do everything that you need it to for 99% of fly fishing. You can fish your streamers on it. You can fish nymphs on it. You can fish dries on it. It does those all very well. And it's only if you're going to specialize in other things that you really need to look outside the 9'5" weight. You're going to be throwing a lot of big bugs and big nymphs, grab a 6 weight. You're throwing a lot of smaller dry flies and doing, small stream fishing, grab a 4 or even a 3 weight if you really want to, right? But that 9'5" weight, it's a sweet spot. It does it all well. It's the Goldilocks rod. I mean, shoot, maybe we ought to call our next 9'5" weight adventures the Goldilocks. We'll have the fly flinger and the Goldilocks. That's fierce, right? But that's why I believe everyone needs those 9'5" weights. So they're just fantastic, and they just flat out get the job done. So thank you, Drew, for sending that question on in. I really appreciate it. Garrett from Nova Scotia has our next question. He writes in and says, "Hey, Spence, just listening to your podcast and enjoying a nice cold Pepsi while I'm on break at work. I recently came across a post on social media that talked about a fly fisherman rubbing power bait on his flies to mask our human scent on them. This post didn't yield any replies, so I was wondering, do fish pick up on a human scent on our flies, knots, and leaders? Or is this an individual just overthinking too much? Thanks again for all the information and tips I've been soaking in from your podcast. Keep them coming. Take care." Hey, Garrett, really great question, except for the whole Pepsi thing. I mean, I say that as I'm sitting here drinking a Pepsi product. I've got a Mountain Dew with me in the studio today, but that does not mean I've had any kind of kerfluffle with a Diet Coke, all right? I still love Diet Coke. I still drink a lot of Diet Coke. I had a 32-ouncer this morning, okay? I hit a wall. It's the last week of school, and for those who don't know, might be new to this, I'm a school teacher. It's the day job, and the last week has just wore me the heck out. So I needed a pick-me-up tonight, but I'm not going to be doing the teaching stuff much longer, though. I'm joining Ventures full-time here in June, so that's actually going to be a lot of fun. I'm leaving teaching to go into fly fishing. That's a career change that you've got to, when that opportunity comes, you've got to take it. Well, anyways, Garrett, I'll shut up. This is not about me. This is about you, all right? Let's address your question. I've heard a lot of folks doing a lot of interesting things to their flies, but this one's really unique. I'll be honest. When I shared this question with Alex, he didn't believe me. His response was, "No way. People do that." Well, yeah, people do that, apparently. But it really is like, this one kind of came out of left field on me. We know trout can smell. We do know that they are attracted to power bait in part due to its smell. So it's safe to assume that trout can probably smell a bit of human on our flies, I would guess. But I would venture to say that if a trout can smell our scent on a fly that's in the water, their sense of smell is probably good enough that rubbing some power bait on it is only going to do the same thing as Tommy Boy rubbing Green Tree air fresheners on himself before meeting Dan Aykroyd, right? It just masks a smell that's already there. And I think this is just completely overboard. That guy might have had his reasons for it, but I've never heard a guide, fly fishing expert, or anybody that I respect in this space talking about worrying about human scent on our flies. Again, that's just never heard that one before. That being said, I do know guides who always wash their hands after putting on sunscreen or bug spray before they touch their fly line, their leaders, or their flies again. And that actually does have some basis in truth. I think mostly due to the oily residue from sunscreen and bug spray, and the fish can smell that. That's a strong scent. I admire this guy's creativity, but it's definitely overkill. But I appreciate you sharing that with us. And yeah, don't worry, Garrett. You are fine. The fish are not smelling you on your flies. I promise you that. James from Kentucky's got another question for us, and he writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, I enjoy listening every week and have taken the time to go back and listen to every podcast from the beginning. They have helped me a lot with understanding fly fishing since I've only been doing it for about a year now. My first question has nothing to do with fly fishing and everything about wings. A fan of wings myself, I enjoy a nice bourbon barbecue or a nice Asian zing. Excuse me. My question is, what is your go-to wing sauce? My second question is, what would be the smallest you would tie a woolly bugger? I recently tied one using scrap material on a size 14 hook, but it ended up working really well. Keep up the good work with the podcast and tight lines. James, I love this question. This is fantastic. I need more coming in just like these. All right. Oh, and I saw a YouTube comment today on one of our videos. Someone said, "Man, Spencer, you must really like wings." And I'm like, "Dude, you have no idea. Okay, it is a serious problem. I just had wings for lunch today. In fact, it's that much of an issue." And my favorite wing sauce is definitely Original Buffalo. I absolutely love the flavor. I can't get enough of that stuff. I've got a couple bottles of it in the fridge. It goes on my eggs. It goes on everything. I love buffalo sauce. So on the rare instance that I get something other than buffalo, I'm usually barbecue or garlic parm kind of guy. Now, on to the fly fishing question, James. I really like what you did here because you tied up a woolly bugger on a hook size that's not exactly typical for them. Woolly buggers are usually tied a little bit bigger, right? They're streamers. They're meant to imitate a leech or another little bait fish. So usually tying them like 10s and 8s and 6s and whatnot, a little bit bigger hook. But you picked one that wasn't quite typical. You just sat down at your tying bench and threw something together based on what you had, and you had success with it. And as a fly tyer, I think that's something that you will learn quickly is that it's always worth it to experiment with your flies. I bet that woolly bugger of yours looked an awful lot like a little leech, and I bet the fish loved that. If I had to guess maybe why they loved it so much, I bet it looked just like that little leech, right? Some of the favorite flies that I use personally have come from me experimenting with different materials, especially when I was out of what I was supposed to use for that fly. For example, the Last Chance Cripple. It's one of my favorite go-to crippled mayfly patterns. It calls for CDC feathers for the wing. The duck butt feathers is what those are. But I don't tie with CDC very much. It's a pain to tie with, and it's a pain to fish with. I'm just not a fan of CDC flies. So I don't always have a ton on hand. Well, I needed to tie some Last Chance Cripples. I was out of CDC. So I ended up tying that cripple with a poly yarn wing instead. And to my eye, it's easier to see on the water, and it floats a little bit better than the CDC fly does. And I haven't noticed it performing any differently than a Last Chance Cripple that was tied the correct way. So that was a nice little discovery for me to make, right? Remember, though, that the goal with all our flies is to imitate something natural, right? That should be our goal with it. So as long as your flies look like something natural, you got to tie them up. Now, going back to your fly, yeah, it's smaller than a typical woolly bugger, but in a size 14, like I mentioned, it's probably a dead ringer for a leech, so they loved it, right? Don't be afraid to experiment with it and try new things. As long as it looks like something natural, you're going to be in business. So thanks for sharing that with us, James. I really appreciate it. Sean from Nebraska has got our next question, writes in and says, "First off, I just wanted to say your podcast is amazing, and I love how much I've learned. I purchased my first fly rod a couple of years ago and was told by a friend that I should go one size heavier for my line weight over my rod weight. I have a 5-weight rod and a 6-weight line was the correct pairing. He said that would give me more distance on my casting when I was just starting to learn. With the line getting a little bit of wear, I was going to be replacing it this year. Should I go 5-weight or 6-weight? Thanks again for everything you do, and Diet Dr. Pepper for the win." Hey, Sean, thanks for writing in. I appreciate what you said about the show as well. Diet Dr. Pepper ain't half bad, but I do wish that they still had that Dr. Pepper 10. That stuff was amazing. I love that stuff. This is actually a fairly common beginner question that we get, and I love answering it, right? It's a good question. What you want to do is you almost always want to match your fly line to the line weight that your rod is weighted for. So you will almost always fish a 5-weight line on a 5-weight rod. When you go a size up, if you fish a 6-weight line on a 5-weight rod, what you're doing is you're adding more mass, more energy to the cast than that 5-weight was designed for. And by doing this, you increase your line speed and your casting distance. So you get tighter loops that are moving a little bit quicker, and you can get them out there further if you have good casting technique. that is, right? If you don't have good casting technique, adding a heavier fly line is not going to help. You've got to know how to cast first. But what you gain there, right? Increased line speed and casting distance. You sacrifice your feel and your ability to delicately present flies in close, at shorter distances, both of which are very important for trout fishing. Now, I said you almost always want to match the line weight on your rod to the line that you choose. Why would you ever decide to do it differently? Well, sometimes you might want that extra line speed and distance, and you don't need the delicacy or the feel, like if you're fishing streamers, for instance. It's very common in bigger fly rods to throw really heavy lines on them, sometimes a full weight and a half heavier even, to try and get the most distance and power out of a rod and line combo. But for what most of us do, which is accurate, delicate casts inside 50 feet, the line that your rod is rated for will bring out the best performance in your rod, which will enable you to make those casts to the best of your abilities. Rod designers do a lot of work fine-tuning tapers to perform ideally under a certain load, so it's best to stick with what they rate a rod for. I'm not trying to tell you, like, only ever color inside the lines, Sean. Don't ever go outside the lines. I'm just saying, the vast majority of situations, your rod's going to perform better, and you are going to get better results if you fish the line weight that it's rated for. And with that, folks, that wraps us up for this week's episode of Untangled. I really appreciate y'all being here this week and taking the time to listen to the show. And if you could, please make sure that you subscribe to us on whatever platform that you're listening to, and go ahead and give us a rating. 5 stars is definitely acceptable on every platform. It just helps when you subscribe and you rate. It helps the visibility of the show increase, so more and more folks can hear the good word of VFC and Untangled, and we can help more people have a better, wonderful day out on the water. And remember, if you ever have a question that you want answered about fly fishing, there's always a link to submit your questions in the podcast description. And until next week, get out on the water, have a great one, and tight lines, everybody.